Amidst the bustling general store, my peace was shattered when the traders suddenly returned after 3 years of vanishing. My mother glanced around with calculating eyes before declaring, "You have always been selfish." I didn't flinch. I simply placed my hand on the secret file. They had no idea that what they left behind for me was not a legacy, but a treacherous $10 million debt. This confrontation is only just beginning. I survived their abandonment, and now I will survive their greed. The debt they used to bury me will now become the very weapon I use to break them. I'm so grateful to have you here. To help us connect, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please drop your city or country in the comments. Also note that this story weaves in fictional details for a better experience. While names and settings are coincidental, the core message remains a valuable lesson for everyone. The morning my parents walked back into my life, they did it the way they had always done everything, without warning, without apology, and with the absolute certainty that the world would rearrange itself around them. I was standing behind the counter of Fry's General when the bell above the door rang at 9:43 on a Tuesday morning in March. The store was running at full speed. A woman I didn't yet know, pushing a cart loaded with handmade hot sauce, had just wheeled in through the front door. Her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a red bandana, chattering in her warm, lilting voice to anyone who would listen. Old James, our resident carpenter and the most quietly stubborn man I had ever met, was helping a young mother carry a handcrafted toy chest to her car, moving slowly but steadily on knees that had given him grief for 30 years. Arthur, my husband, was in the back office running quarterly numbers, his voice drifting faintly through the half-open door as he worked through figures on the phone. Everything was exactly the way I had built it to be: purposeful, breathing, mine. Then Douglas Fry walked through the door. He looked different, thinner, across the face, with deep, new lines carved into his forehead that had not been there 3 years ago. But the way he carried himself had not changed at all. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, his eyes moving across the store the way a man surveys a room he believes he owns. My mother Vivian followed 2 steps behind him, her designer handbag, the last one she could still afford, I suspected, hanging from the crook of her elbow. Her lipstick was fresh, and her posture was immaculate, the way it always was when she was performing. Behind her came Garrett, my older brother, freshly shaved and wearing a suit jacket that pulled just slightly too tight across the shoulders, like a costume borrowed from a version of himself that no longer existed. I watched the 3 of them cross the threshold and felt something lock into place in the center of my chest. Not fear, not the grief I might have expected. Something colder and steadier, the particular feeling of watching a storm you have been tracking on the horizon for a very long time finally make landfall. Sienna. My father's voice cut through the morning noise like a blade. He said my name the way he always had, not as a greeting but as a summons. I set down the clipboard I was holding and met his gaze without flinching. "Dad," I said evenly, "this is a surprise." "It shouldn't be." His eyes swept the store again, and something shifted behind them. Part calculation, part hunger, part the dull resentment of a man who had expected to walk into chaos and found order instead. "We've been back in the country for 2 weeks." "I know," I said. That caught him off guard. His jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek jumping once before he controlled it. "Then you know why we're here." Across the store, Mrs. Rosa had gone very still, her hand resting on a jar of hot sauce she had stopped pretending to arrange. Old James had straightened up from the toy chest, his broad shoulders squaring almost imperceptibly. 2 other regulars near the back had stopped their conversation, their attention drifting toward us the way water naturally finds a crack. My mother stepped forward and lowered her voice to what she imagined was a discreet register. "We thought it would be best to do this in person," she said, her smile arriving on cue, the practiced one, the one she deployed when she needed something and wanted you to feel like you were the one offering it. As a family. Garrett had said nothing yet. He stood with his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze drifting across the hand-lettered signage, the display of locally sourced goods. The framed photograph on the far wall of our very first market day, 40 people in a parking lot, 4 folding tables, and more hope than sense. Something moved across his face as he stared at that photograph. Not admiration. Something dimmer than that and more complicated, and followed quickly by something that looked uncomfortably like envy. "Nice setup," he said at last, and somehow managed to make it sound like an accusation. I turned back to my father. "What do you want, Dad?" Douglas squared his shoulders and looked at me, the way he had looked at me my entire life, like I was a variable in an equation he had already solved. "The store," he said. "It's time to talk about what happens to it next." The sentence landed with weight, the kind you feel in your sternum rather than your ears. "What happens next?" I repeated. "The family is going through a difficult period." His voice settled into the tone he used for boardrooms: reasonable, controlled, calibrated to make resistance seem unreasonable. "Garrett needs a foundation. Your mother and I need stability. You have done well here, Sienna, I mean that. But this was always meant to be a family asset. It's time to bring it back under proper management." Garrett took that as his cue. He turned from the photograph and faced me fully. "Nobody's trying to take anything from you," he said. His voice cracked just slightly on the last word, a hairline fracture in the performance, thin enough that a stranger might have missed it. "We just think as the eldest, I should have a leadership role going forward. It's the logical structure." I looked at my brother for a long moment. His eyes were rimmed red at the edges. His hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. "A leadership role," I said. "That's right." I nodded once. And then I smiled. Not the warm kind, not the wounded kind, but the kind that lives on the other side of both, the smile of someone who had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this conversation and had arrived at this moment with everything already in place. I reached beneath the counter and rested my fingers lightly on the edge of a folder I had placed there that very morning. The same morning I had seen the flight alert notification telling me their plane from Paris had landed in Portland. My father's eyes dropped to the folder. Something shifted behind them. Just a crack. Just enough. "What is that?" he asked. "The beginning," I said, "of a very long overdue conversation." I left the folder closed. I let it sit on the counter between us like a question none of them knew how to answer. Because the truth was, this story did not start today. It did not start the moment they walked through my door with their rehearsed speeches and their hollow smiles and their talk of family and duty and what was owed. It started 3 years ago, on a Tuesday morning just like this one. The morning I called my father's number and stood in an empty office listening to it ring and ring and ring until a lawyer I had never met slid a document across a table with my name printed at the top, above a number that made the ground feel like it was falling away beneath my feet. $10 million! That was what they had left me. Not an inheritance, not a future. A debt with my name on it and no explanation attached. And that was where the real story began. 3 years earlier, I remember the way the parking lot looked that morning: too empty, too quiet for a Tuesday at 8:30. 2 spaces where there were usually 6, and the back entrance propped open with a brick, the way it only ever was when the cleaning crew came through on weekends. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself my father had probably called an early team meeting off-site, that my mother was running late, that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation sitting just around the corner of my understanding. I was good at that, finding reasonable explanations. I had spent years perfecting the skill. I pushed through the front door and the silence hit me like something physical. No phones ringing, no voices carrying down the hall. The receptionist's desk was bare, and I mean bare, not just empty of people, but stripped of the small accumulated evidence of occupancy. No coffee mug, no notepad, no framed photograph that had sat in the same spot for 11 years. Just a clean surface and a chair pushed in too neatly. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up. I walked down the hall to my father's office and pushed the door open. The desk was clear. The filing cabinet drawers hung open and empty. The family portrait that had hung above the credenza since before I could remember was gone, leaving a pale rectangle on the wall where the paint had never faded. Miss Fry. I spun around. A man I had never seen before was standing in the doorway behind me, mid-50s gray suit, a leather briefcase held in front of him with both hands like a shield. He had the careful eyes of someone delivering news he would rather not deliver. "I'm Richard Holt. I'm the corporate attorney retained by your father to manage the transition, though. As of this morning, I no longer represent him. I've been waiting for you. I'm I'm sorry to be the one to do this." My mouth went dry. "Do what?" I said, even though some part of me had already started to understand. He set the briefcase on the desk and opened it. Inside was a stack of documents organized with the kind of meticulous precision that told me someone had spent considerable time preparing them. He slid the first page toward me. It was a debt summary. My name was printed at the top in clean black type, Sienna Fry, followed by a column of figures that blurred together until the total at the bottom snapped into focus. $10,240,000. "That can't be right," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. My hands braced against the edge of the desk where a different story I could feel them trembling all the way up to my elbows. This is the company debt. This is business liability. My name shouldn't be on this. Your name was added to the primary loan agreements 18 months ago." Richard Holt said carefully, each word placed like a foot on uncertain ground. "As a co-signatory, the corporate restructuring documents were filed in your name in October. You are legally the sole responsible party for these obligations." The room tilted. I gripped the desk harder and forced myself to breathe one slow inhale, one slow exhale, the way I used to do before swim meets in high school, when the cold water and the noise of the crowd made everything feel too large. "Where are my parents?" My voice cracked on the last word, splitting open like a seam that had been holding too long. Richard Holt hesitated. "Their flight departed last night," he said. "Portland to Paris. I was instructed to inform you this morning." I pressed my hand flat against the desk. The laminate was cool under my palm, and I focused on that. The temperature, the texture, the simple physical fact of something solid, because if I let myself feel the full weight of what he had just said, I was not sure I would be able to stay upright. "And the house, I asked. "The property was transferred to Garrett Fry's name 3 months ago." He slid another document forward. I did not look at it. "I'm sorry, Ms. Fry, I genuinely am." I stood there for a long time staring at my name on that piece of paper. Sienna Fry. 2 words I had carried my whole life. 2 words that now had a price tag attached to them that I had never agreed to pay. Then my phone buzzed on the desk. A text message from a number I did not recognize. No name, no greeting. Just an address in the warehouse district on the south side of Portland, and 4 words beneath it. "Come, your grandfather." I picked up my phone. I picked up my bag. And I walked out of that office without looking back, because looking back, I had finally learned, was how they had always kept me from moving forward. Arthur was waiting for me in the parking lot. He had driven over the moment I called him, 15 minutes from our apartment, no questions asked, just, "I'm on my way," and the sound of keys already jingling in the background. That was the thing about Arthur Reeves, my husband of 4 years and the steadiest person I had ever known. He did not ask you to explain yourself before he showed up. He showed up first and let the explaining come later when you were ready. He was leaning against the hood of our car when I pushed through the building's front door, and the moment he saw my face, whatever carefully assembled composure I had managed to hold together inside that office, his own expression shifted into something quiet and fierce at the same time. He crossed the parking lot in 4 strides and wrapped both arms around me, and I pressed my face against his shoulder and breathed. I did not cry. I wanted to. Every part of me wanted to. But crying felt like surrender, and I was not ready to surrender. Not yet. Tell me, he said into my hair. So I told him. All of it. The empty office. Richard Holt. $10 million with my name on it. The Paris flight. Garrett's name on the deed. By the time I finished, Arthur's jaw was so tight I could see the muscle working in his cheek, and his hands on my shoulders had gone rigid. "We're going to fix this," he said. "I know," I said. But first, I held up my phone. "We have somewhere to be." The address led us south away from the glass towers and manicured streets of downtown Portland into a neighborhood of low brick buildings and narrow sidewalks where the shop signs were hand-painted and the trees grew in broken patterns through cracked concrete. Arthur pulled up in front of a 3-story building wedged between a laundromat and a print shop, and we sat there for a moment, both of us staring at the peeling paint on the front door and the single buzzard yellow light above it. "This is it?" Arthur said. "According to the text, I said. We found apartment 2B at the end of a narrow hallway that smelled of old wood and something faintly familiar, a cedar and tobacco smell that reached into my chest and pulled at something I could not immediately name. I knocked. There was a pause, then the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Then the door opened. My grandfather looked at me for a long moment without speaking, and then something in his face shifted. Not surprise, not relief, but the particular expression of a man who has been waiting a very long time for something and has finally watched it arrive. "Sienna," he said. Silas Fry was 81 years old, lean and straight-backed in the way of men who had spent decades refusing to let gravity win. His white hair was neatly combed, his hands steady. His eyes the same sharp, unhurried gray I remembered from childhood, the kind of eyes that made you feel, even at 34 years old, like he could read the sentence you were still composing in your head. "Grandpa." My voice broke on the second syllable. I had not planned for that. I had planned to be composed, to be practical, to ask the questions I needed answered. Instead, I felt the whole morning rush up behind me like a wave, and for one terrible second my legs felt like they might not hold. Arthur caught my elbow. He steadied me without making a production of it, without saying a word, just a firm hand and a half step closer. Silas stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. "Both of you." The apartment was small and spare a single room, with a narrow bed, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf that ran floor to ceiling along the far wall. No television, no decorative clutter. The only photograph in the room was propped on the bookshelf, him and me taken when I was 7 years old at the 4th of July parade, both of us laughing at something outside the frame of the picture. "You knew," I said. I had not planned to lead with that either, but the words came out before I could arrange them properly. "You knew what they were going to do." He lowered himself into one of the chairs with the careful economy of movement that age demands and said, "Sit down, Sienna." "I don't want to sit down. I want to know how long you knew." He looked at me steadily. "I started watching your father 20 years ago," he said. "When he borrowed money from a business partner and repaid it with funds that were not his to use. It was a small thing. I told myself it was a mistake." His voice was even measured, the voice of a man recounting history rather than feeling it. "But small things done without consequence become large things. I should have acted sooner. I did not. That is the only regret I carry. And 5 years ago, I pressed. 5 years ago, I had enough." He reached into the breast pocket of his cardigan and withdrew a small envelope. I began documenting everything systematically. Every transfer, every restructured loan, every company formed in a name that was not mine to use. He paused. "Including yours." The air went out of my lungs. "He used my name." "For years," Silas said. "I am sorry. I should have come to you sooner. But if I had, they would have known I knew, and they would have moved faster. I needed them to believe they had succeeded." He opened the envelope and set a key on the table between us. It was old dull, the kind of key that belonged to something that had been locked for a long time. An address was written on a small card beneath it, a street on the south side of the city I vaguely recognized and mostly associated with boarded windows and broken gutters. "What is this?" I asked. It's a building," he said. "It belonged to me. Now it belongs to you." He held my gaze. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I should give you money instead. Something immediate. Something that solves the problem in front of you." He leaned forward slightly. "I thought about it. For a long time I thought about it. But money would not protect you. Your parents would find a way to reach it. Or you would use it to pay debts that were never legally yours, and in doing so, you would confirm them. What I am giving you instead is something they cannot touch. Something you have to build. Because the only way to be safe, truly safe, is to build something they do not own." He sat back. "Look at what people in that neighborhood lack," he said. "Not what you want to give them. What they lack." I picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked. Arthur leaned forward from his chair and rested his forearms on his knees, studying my grandfather with the focused expression he wore when he was assembling a problem in his mind. "What's in the building?" he asked. Silas allowed himself the smallest possible smile. "Go find out," he said. 30 minutes later, I parked our car in front of a squat 2-story building on a block where 3 out of 5 storefronts were dark. The sign above the door was faded to near illegibility. One of the front windows was cracked. A pigeon was sitting on the doorstep with the proprietary stillness of something that had not been disturbed in a very long time. I sat there with the key in my hand, looking at it, and felt the last small ember of the hope I had been carefully protecting all morning gutter and nearly go dark. Behind me, Arthur put his hand over mine. "Okay," he said quietly. "We go in anyway." The smell hit us before our eyes could adjust to the dark. Damp wood. Old dust. Something underneath both of those that I could not immediately identify, a faint sweetness like fruit, left too long in a warm room. Arthur reached around the doorframe and found a light switch and a row of fluorescent tubes stuttered to life overhead, 2 of them buzzing and flickering with the exhausted determination of things that had been failing slowly for a very long time. We stood in the doorway and looked at what my grandfather had given us. The space was roughly 40 feet wide and 60 feet deep, with wooden shelving units running floor to ceiling along both side walls, most of them empty or holding the ghost shapes of inventory long since cleared or rotted. The linoleum floor was cracked in long diagonal lines, lifting at the corners where moisture had gotten underneath. The back wall had a door that led to a storage room, and beyond that, a narrow office barely large enough to hold a desk and 2 chairs. Above everything, a layer of undisturbed dust lay over every surface, like the store had simply stopped in the middle of a Tuesday years ago, and no one had thought to tell it. "Well," Arthur said. "Don't," I said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say something reasonable and measured, and I cannot hear reasonable right now." He looked at me sideways. "I was going to say we're going to need a lot of trash bags." Something loosened in my chest. Not laughter exactly, but the closest thing to it I had managed all day. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment, breathing through it, and then I straightened up and walked to the nearest shelving unit and grabbed the first broken thing I found. We worked for 6 hours straight. Arthur made 3 trips to the hardware store 2 blocks over. The only thing either of us had thought to bring was the folder of debt documents still sitting in the back seat of the car, which was not particularly useful for cleaning purposes. We bought trash bags, a mop, 2 buckets, a bottle of industrial cleaner that the guy behind the register said would cut through 30 years of accumulated grime. He was not wrong. By mid-afternoon, we had cleared the front 2/3 of the floor, hauled 8 bags of debris to the dumpster in the alley behind the building, and discovered that under the grime, the linoleum was a perfectly serviceable shade of cream tile that someone at some point had clearly been proud of. It was around 3 o'clock when the bell above the front door rang a small tentative sound, like whoever was on the other side was not entirely sure they were welcome. A woman stood in the doorway somewhere in her mid-60s, a dish towel tucked into the front pocket of her jeans. She was holding a plate covered with aluminum foil, and she was looking at me with the particular combination of curiosity and warmth that I had learned to associate with people who had lived on the same block for 30 years and considered the neighborhood's business their own. "You the new owner?" she asked. I said. She nodded like this confirmed something she had already suspected and walked in without waiting to be invited. "Rosa Delgado," she said, extending the hand that wasn't holding the plate. "I've been on this block since before this store was even open. Before it closed, too." She set the plate on the counter and peeled back the foil to reveal a stack of tamales. "You haven't eaten, I can tell. People who've eaten don't look like that." Arthur let out a breath that was almost a laugh and reached for a tamale before I could say anything. "Arthur Reeves," he said. "Thank you. Genuinely." Mrs. Rosa looked at him, then at me, then at the bags of debris visible through the front window where Arthur had stacked them by the curb. "Big mess," she said. "We've noticed," I said. "This block needs a store," she said in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than offering an opinion. "The nearest grocery is 40 minutes by bus." 40 minutes? You know what people do when they can't get to food easy. They eat what's close. What's close here is a gas station and a liquor store. She looked at me directly. "So whatever you're planning to do with this place, do it right." I held her gaze. My legs were aching. My back was tight from 6 hours of hauling and scrubbing, and my phone had rung 4 times in the last hour from a number I had already identified as belonging to a debt collection agency called Meridian Recovery Group, the firm my father had apparently contracted to manage the repayment of obligations bearing my name. I had not answered. I was not ready to answer. But I knew I could not avoid them forever, and every call I missed felt like another inch of water rising. "I'm going to do it right," I told her. Mrs. Rosa studied me for a moment the way someone does when they are deciding whether a person's words match the thing behind their eyes. Whatever she found there, it seemed to satisfy her. "Good," she said. "I make hot sauce. 12 varieties. My daughter says I make too much. She's wrong, but that's beside the point. If you ever want to sell it here, you come talk to me." She left the way she had arrived without ceremony, without waiting for a formal response. The bell above the door rang again, and then she was gone, and the store was quiet except for the buzz of the 2 failing fluorescent tubes and the faint sound of traffic from the street. Arthur stood beside me, chewing a tamale, looking at the space around us. "One neighbor," he said. "One neighbor," I agreed. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and opened the camera. "I'm going to start documenting this," he said. "Everything. From the beginning. I don't know what for yet, but something about this." He looked around slowly, taking in the cracked floor and the empty shelves and the plate of tamales on the counter. "Feels like something people should see." I looked at him. 4 years of marriage had taught me to trust that instinct when he had it. "Do it," I said. That evening, I sat on the floor of the back office with the old ledger books Arthur had found under the desk, the kind that had been kept by hand in careful columns, the store's original records going back 15 years. The last entry was dated 4 years ago. Revenue negative. Inventory expired. Outstanding vendor payments 6 months overdue. The store had not failed suddenly. It had bled out slowly over years in small losses that nobody had thought worth fixing. I closed the ledger, pressed my palms against my eyes. My phone rang again. Meridian Recovery Group. I stared at the screen until it stopped. Then I counted what was left in our joint account, the account we had transferred our personal savings into before the company accounts were frozen. After the supplies, after gas, after the hardware store run, we had enough to cover approximately 11 days of living expenses and roughly 1 week of minimum interest on the debt. 11 days. I set the phone face down on the floor and stared at the ceiling and thought about what my grandfather had said. "Look at what people lack, not what you want to give them." I was still turning that sentence over in my mind when Arthur appeared in the doorway of the office. "Come look at this," he said. "The storage room in the back. There's a workbench someone left behind still solid. And the back wall? The brick is original. It's actually beautiful under all the dust." I stood up. My knees protested. I followed him anyway. We stayed until 10 o'clock that night, making a list of everything the space could be and everything it currently was not. By the time we locked the front door and walked to the car, the list of possibilities was longer than the list of problems. Not by much, but enough. The next morning, I arrived at 7:15 to find a man standing at the door. He was somewhere in his late 60s, spare and weathered, with the kind of hands that came from decades of physical work. He was holding a broom, not one of ours, his own, the bristles worn evenly in the way of something used every day. He looked at me with calm, unhurried eyes. "I'm here to help," he said. I looked at him. "Who sent you?" He considered the question for a moment. "Does it matter?" he said. I decided to let him in. Not because I trusted him. I did not know him well enough to trust him, but because I was running on 4 hours of sleep and a tamale. The fluorescent tubes in the back half of the store had given up entirely overnight, and a man who showed up at 7 in the morning with his own broom was not a man I had the luxury of turning away. "Walter Cole," he said when I stepped aside to let him through. He did not offer a hand to shake. He just walked past me and got to work, moving with the particular efficiency of someone who knows exactly what needs doing and has no interest in discussing it first. "Sienna Fry," I said to his back. "I know," he said. I stood there for a moment watching him sweep, and that single answer, flat, unhurried, entirely unconcerned, with how strange it sounded, lodged itself somewhere in the back of my mind and stayed there. Arthur arrived 20 minutes later with coffee and a bag of bagels, and stopped short when he saw Walter in the far corner of the store methodically clearing dust from the base of the shelving units, with the focus of a man performing a task he had done 100 times before. "Who's that?" Arthur said quietly, handing me a cup. "Walter Cole?" I said. "He's helping." Arthur looked at him for a long moment. "Does he know us?" I asked. He didn't answer. Arthur pulled out his phone and hit record. "Okay," he said, more to himself than to me. "Okay." Walter Cole stayed until 6 o'clock that evening, and he came back the next morning and the one after that. He did not volunteer his history. He did not explain how he had heard about us or why he had chosen to show up. What he did quietly and without ceremony was work, and somewhere inside that work, he began to teach us things we had not known to ask about. The first lesson came on the 4th day when Meridian Recovery Group called again. I had been avoiding the calls. Every time that number flashed across my screen, my stomach clenched, and I set the phone face down and told myself I would deal with it tomorrow. Arthur had noticed, and he had the good sense not to say anything directly, because he knew me well enough to know that saying anything directly would only make me dig in. Walter apparently had also noticed. He was restocking the middle shelves we had started bringing in small amounts of basic goods on credit from a wholesale supplier 2 blocks over when my phone buzzed for the 3rd time that morning. I turned it face down on the counter. Walter set down the can of beans he was holding and looked at me. "They will not stop," he said simply. "Avoiding them costs you more than it saves." "I know that," I said, sharper than I meant to. Then answer," he said. "But do not apologize, and do not agree to anything. Ask them to send all communication in writing. Tell them you are aware of your rights under the FDCPA." He paused. "The Fair Debt Collection Practices Act," he added without waiting for me to ask. "It limits what they can do and when. Most collectors count on people not knowing that." I stared at him. "How do you know that?" He picked up the can of beans again. "I have dealt with difficult people in difficult situations for a long time," he said. "That is all." It was not all. I was certain it was not all. But I picked up the phone and I called them back, and I said exactly what he had told me to say, and by the end of the conversation, Meridian Recovery Group had agreed to put all future communication in writing and to hold escalation proceedings for 30 days, pending a formal review of the debt's origin. The woman on the other end of the line sounded like she had not had someone respond that way in a very long time. When I put the phone down, my hand was shaking, not from fear this time, but from something closer to relief, the specific relief of discovering that the thing you have been dreading is survivable after all. Thank you, I said. Walter nodded once and went back to the shelves. It was the following afternoon when he took us outside. Not for a walk exactly, more of a directed observation. He moved slowly through the block, pointing out small things with a tilt of his head or a word or two. The corner where 3 elderly residents sat in lawn chairs every afternoon with nowhere particular to be. The mother pushing a double stroller past the gas station, stopping to look at the snack display, then walking on without buying anything. The group of teenagers sitting on a wall outside the closed laundromat because there was simply nowhere else to sit. What do you see? Walter asked. People, I said. What do they need? I looked at the mother with the stroller, at the teenagers, at the 3 older men in their lawn chairs. Not what we've been trying to sell them, I said slowly. Walter said nothing. He had a way of letting silence do the work that most people wasted words on. It was old James who gave me the second piece of the picture. He had lived in the building next door for 32 years and worked as a carpenter out of a rented workshop 2 streets over. He was 73 years old, broad-shouldered with sawdust permanently embedded in the creases of his knuckles, and he had a tendency to appear at the store's open front door in the afternoons, the way neighborhood dogs appear without plan, without agenda, simply drawn by the activity of the place. You got good bones here, he told me one afternoon, running one hand along the wooden shelving frame near the entrance. Original construction. They don't make joinery like this anymore. Can you fix what's broken? I asked. He looked at me sideways as if checking whether I was serious. What can't I fix? He said. I can't pay you, I said directly. Not yet. He was quiet for a moment. My grandson needs a job, he said finally. 18 years old and nobody will hire him because of an old record. If there's work here, maybe you find room for him too. I looked at old James, at the careful pride in the way he held himself, at the particular dignity of a man who knew his own worth and was asking for something completely different. Let me think about that, I said. That evening, long after Walter had gone and old James had shuffled back next door, I sat at the back office desk with a legal pad and started writing. Mrs. Rosa had more hot sauce than she could sell door to door. Old James built furniture and fixtures nobody in this neighborhood could afford to buy at retail. The woman on the second floor of the building across the street, whose name I did not yet know, had been selling handmade candles out of a cardboard box on the front step every Saturday. Skills everywhere, no platform, no reach, no one to connect what these people made with the people who needed it. I wrote the word consignment at the top of the page and stared at it. Arthur appeared in the doorway, phone still in hand from whatever he had been filming outside. I want to show you something, he said, and his voice had a different quality in it, the alert, focused energy he got when an idea was taking shape. He turned the phone screen toward me. 4 minutes of footage, old James examining the shelving, Mrs. Rosa arranging her sauce bottles with the care of someone displaying fine art, Walter sweeping in long, steady strokes in the background. 4 minutes. The comments under the clip he had posted it to a small account he had been building for months were already running to 40 replies. This is beautiful. Where is this? This is the most human thing I've seen on here in months. Please keep posting. I looked at the screen, then at Arthur, then back at my legal pad at the single word at the top. We open in 2 weeks, I said. The next morning, I arrived at 7 to find not one unfamiliar presence at the door, but 4. 4 men in dark jackets standing in a row on the front step, each holding a copy of the same document. One of them stepped forward when he saw me come around the corner. Ms. Fry, he said, we're here on behalf of your father, Douglas Fry, and Meridian Recovery Group. We have a formal notice of accelerated repayment demand. You have 72 hours. 72 hours. I stood on the sidewalk in front of my own store and looked at the four men blocking my entrance, and I felt something I had not felt since the morning I walked into my father's empty office, the specific nauseating vertigo of a floor dropping away beneath your feet before you have had time to catch yourself. The man who had spoken was in his mid-40s, clean-shaven with the practiced blankness of someone paid to deliver bad news without letting it touch him. He held out a document folder with one hand. "You'll want to review the formal notice," he said. "Payment in full or initiating asset seizure proceedings. You have until Friday at 9 a.m. My throat tightened. I took the folder because refusing it would have accomplished nothing. The paper inside was dense with legal language accelerated repayment breach of co-signatory obligation authorization for collection of tangible assets at the address of record. My address. My store. "This is a mistake," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "The figures are clearly outlined on page 2, the man said. "No." I pressed the folder back toward him. "I mean the debt itself is a mistake. These obligations were created under fraudulent circumstances. I am formally disputing the validity of this debt." That caught him. Just slightly a small shift behind the eyes, the collector's equivalent of a stumble. "Ma'am, the documentation supporting all future contact needs to be in writing." My voice had found its footing now. I was still shaking somewhere deep in my chest, but it was not showing, and that was enough. "And I will be responding in writing with a formal dispute notice. Under Section 809 of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, your agency is required to pause all collection activities until the validity of this debt is verified. I expect that to be honored." There was a silence among the four of them, the kind that comes when someone in a group realizes the conversation has taken a turn they were not briefed for. Then Walter Cole appeared at my shoulder. He had come from inside the store quietly and without announcement, and he stood beside me with the unhurried calm of a man who has stood in difficult places before, and found that calmness more than anything else is what difficult places require. He looked at the lead collector for a moment without speaking, then said, "Excuse me," and stepped forward 2 paces. He spoke to the man quietly, low enough that I could not catch the words. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a single folded document which he held out briefly for the collector to read, not to take, just to read. The man's eyes moved down the page. Once, then again. When Walter stepped back, the collector's posture had shifted. Something had gone out of it, not the professionalism, but the forward momentum, the practiced certainty that he was the person in control of this conversation. "We'll be in contact in writing," the collector said. "Our office will review the dispute documentation. In the meantime, we're granting a 30-day administrative hold pending verification." I looked at him. 30 days, I repeated. "That's correct." He gathered his folder, exchanged a brief look with one of the men behind him that I could not read, and then all 4 of them walked back to the black sedan parked at the curb and drove away without another word. The sidewalk felt very quiet after they left. From the doorway of the laundromat 2 buildings over, the owner, a stocky man named Frank, who had nodded at me every morning for 2 weeks without ever actually speaking to me, called out, "You all right over there?" "Fine," I said. "Thank you, Frank." He pointed a finger at me. "Those guys come back. You come get me." Then he went back inside, and the moment closed behind him as simply as it had opened. Mrs. Rosa had been watching from just inside the store entrance, one hand braced against the doorframe, her expression a complicated mixture of relief and indignation. "Your father sent them," she said when I came back inside. "His people," I said. She made a sound deep in her throat that needed no translation. "You want me to call my nephew?" she said. "He's a paralegal. Not a lawyer yet, but he reads everything." "Not yet," I said, "but thank you." I turned to Walter. He was already back at the shelves straightening a row of canned goods with the equanimity of a man who had not just diffused a situation that had made my knees go soft. "That document you showed him," I said. What was it? Oh, a notice, he said, not looking up. Formally asserting that the debt's origin is under investigation for fraud, and that any agency collecting on it does so at legal risk to themselves. He adjusted a can of soup. Your grandfather had it prepared some time ago. I have been carrying it since the day I arrived. I stared at the back of his head. He knew they would come. He knew, Walter said simply. I wanted to ask more. I wanted to sit him down and go through every single thing my grandfather had known, and when he had known it, and what else he had prepared without telling me. But my phone buzzed with a message from Arthur back in 10 had to make a supply run, and there was inventory to check, and a consignment proposal to draft for Mrs. Rosa and old James, and the woman upstairs, whose name I had finally learned was Patricia, and who made the most extraordinary beeswax candles I had ever seen. So I went back to work. By 7 that evening, the store was quiet. Arthur had come back, filmed another 30 minutes of footage, and gone to the office in the back to edit. I was restocking the last of the day's returns when I heard it. A sound from the storage room. Not the settling building sound I had gotten used to over 2 weeks of late nights. Something different, sharp, deliberate, repeated at intervals that had a rhythm to them. Metal on stone. I crossed the floor in 6 steps and pushed the storage room door open. 3 men I had never seen before were inside, 2 of them working crowbars along the edges of the floor tiles near the far wall, prying them up with short, efficient movements. The third was standing watch near the back entrance, and he turned the moment the light from the store fell across the room. Hey, I started. Arthur! I shouted loud enough that my voice cracked. Arthur, call 911 right now. The man near the door moved first. The man near the back entrance moved faster than I expected from someone who had just been caught in the act. He shoved past the other 2 and hit the alley door with his shoulder, and the other 2 followed without hesitation, all 3 of them gone through the back before I had crossed half the length of the storage room. I stood in the middle of the space they had left behind, breathing hard, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly I could hear it. The floor in the far corner was a mess of broken tiles and disturbed concrete pried up in a rough semicircle about 4 feet wide. Whatever they had been looking for, they had not found it. Not yet. Arthur appeared in the doorway behind me, phone pressed to his ear. They're on their way, he said. 2 minutes. He looked at the damage, and something shifted in his expression, less shock than a focused, angular attention. They were looking for something specific, he said. I know, I said. The police arrived in 4 minutes. 2 officers, both of them thorough and unhurried in the way of people accustomed to being called to situations that had already resolved themselves by the time they got there. They took photographs, took our statements, filed an incident report under breaking and entering and property damage. They confirmed what I already knew. 3 men unknown fled through the rear alley before they arrived, no plates visible on any vehicle in the adjacent street. The chance of identifying them without additional information was low. You want to press charges if we find them? The senior officer asked. Absolutely, I said. After they left, Arthur and I stood in the storage room and looked at the torn-up floor for a long moment without speaking. Then Arthur crouched down and used his phone's flashlight to illuminate the exposed space beneath the broken tiles. Sienna, he said, come look at this. I crouched beside him. Set into the concrete subfloor flush with the surface was a steel panel roughly 18 inches square, with a recessed handle and a combination dial set into its center. Not new. The steel had the dull, mottled patina of something installed decades ago. Whoever had been here tonight had found the edge of it before the sirens arrived. We sat back on our heels and looked at each other. Your grandfather, Arthur said. My grandfather, I said. We were still there 20 minutes later when Walter Cole appeared at the alley entrance quietly without knocking the way he always arrived. I heard the police radio, he said, stepping over a broken tile. He looked at the safe without any apparent surprise, the way a person looks at something they have known about for a long time, but have been waiting for the right moment to acknowledge. You knew it was here, I said. It was not a question. Walter reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small folded piece of paper. He said you would find it eventually, he said. He also said you would need this. I unfolded it. 8 digits written in my grandfather's precise, unhurried handwriting. My hands were trembling by the time I dialed the last number. The locking mechanism disengaged with a sound like a held breath, releasing a clean, solid click that echoed in the narrow storage room. I lifted the panel. Inside, sealed in a series of heavy-duty waterproof document sleeves, was the largest collection of organized paperwork I had ever seen outside of a law office. Bank statements, wire transfer records, corporate registration documents, internal correspondence, tax filings with handwritten annotations in the margins, and photographs printed and dated, some going back more than a decade, of meetings, of handshakes, of transactions conducted in places that were clearly chosen for their privacy. Every document bore the same name across its header: Douglas Fry. Arthur sat down on the edge of the broken tile and began going through the sleeves with the careful, methodical attention of someone who has worked in communications long enough to understand that information properly organized tells a story more effectively than any narration. He did not speak for several minutes. Then he stopped. He held up a page, a corporate registration document, the kind filed with a state secretary of state's office. His face had gone pale in the yellow light of his phone's flashlight, the color draining from it so visibly that my chest constricted before I had even read what he was holding. Sienna. His voice was different, quiet in a way that was not calm. Look at the registered agent. I took the page from him. I read the name in the designated field. Sienna of Fry. I went through the next sleeve. And the next. On every corporate registration, on every loan agreement, on every document creating the shell entities through which money had moved and disappeared and reappeared scrubbed of its original source, my name. My signature, or what passed for it, reproduced with enough accuracy to have gotten through processing at multiple institutions without a flag. He used my name, I said. My voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere outside my body. For all of it, every company, every loan. For years, Walter said from where he stood near the door. I set the document down carefully. My hands had stopped shaking, which I found strange, because what I was feeling was not calm, it was something else. Something that moved differently than panic and differently than grief. Something colder and more structural. The feeling of an entire architecture becoming visible at once. My grandfather had known. He had sat in that small room and handed me a rusted key and told me to look at what people lacked, and the whole time, this had been here. Waiting under the floor of a crumbling store in a neighborhood where nobody came looking for anything of value. He had built a vault and disguised it as nothing. We need to photograph every page, I said. Tonight. Everything before anyone else comes back for it. Arthur was already moving. Way ahead of you, he said. We worked until 2 in the morning. When we were done, every document had been photographed twice, once on Arthur's phone, once on mine, and the originals were resealed in their protective sleeves and returned to the safe. I locked it and replaced the tiles as best I could with what we had available, then slid a heavy shelving unit over the corner to discourage any repeat visit. I stood at the back alley entrance before we left, looking at the narrow strip of night sky above the buildings, and I thought about what it meant to build a secret. The patience it required, the faith it demanded that someday someone would be standing in exactly the right place to find it. Then I went home. Because tomorrow Natalie was arriving from Seattle, and what came next required more than evidence. It required a plan. Natalie Brooks arrived at 8 in the morning with a rolling suitcase, a tray of 4 coffees, and an expression of pure, uncomplicated delight. "Oh, this is perfect," she said, standing in the middle of the store and turning in a slow circle, eyes bright. "This is absolutely perfect." I stared at her. "Natalie, the floor has a crack you could lose a quarter in." "Character," she said firmly, and set the coffees on the counter. "Sienna, I've designed spaces in 4 cities for people who spent $200,000 trying to make something look exactly like this. The bones here are extraordinary. Give me a week. Natalie Brooks had been my closest friend since our freshman year of college, when she had knocked on my dormitory door to borrow a stapler, and stayed for 3 hours talking about color theory and bad architecture. She had built her design practice in Seattle from a single client referral into a firm with 12 employees and a waiting list, and she had a talent rare and completely unglamorous for seeing what a space could be rather than what it was. When I had called her 4 days ago and told her everything she had listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she had said, "Tell me when you need me there." I had said Saturday. She had booked a flight that night. Arthur came out of the back office with his laptop, and the 4 of us, Natalie, Arthur, Walter, and I, sat around the counter with our coffees, and I laid out the idea I had been building in my head since the night I wrote the word consignment on a legal pad. The neighborhood had talent. Mrs. Rosa with her hot sauce, old James with his woodwork, Patricia upstairs with her beeswax candles, a retired schoolteacher named Howard on the next block who grew and dried his own herbs and packaged them in hand-labeled glass jars. A woman named Grace who repaired vintage clothing and had boxes of finished pieces with nowhere to sell them. None of them had a platform. None of them had packaging or branding or a way to get their work in front of people who would pay what it was worth. The store could be all of that. We don't sell their products, I said. We represent them. 60% to the maker, 40% to the store. We photograph everything, build a single brand umbrella, handle all the customer-facing work. They make. We connect. Natalie set down her coffee cup with a decisive click. What's the brand called? I don't know yet. The Common Table, she said immediately. Because that's what it is. Everyone brings what they make, it goes on the table, everyone eats. She looked at me. That's the whole idea, isn't it? It was exactly the idea. I had not known how to say it until she did. Natalie spent 4 days redesigning the store interior, not expensively, but precisely with the particular skill of someone who understands that attention costs nothing but changes everything. She repainted the shelving units in a warm cream that made the original wood grain glow. She created hand-lettered product cards for each maker giving their name and a single line about who they were. She photographed every product on a piece of reclaimed wood old James had planed and finished in 2 hours, complaining the whole time that it was simple work, and then producing something that looked like it belonged in a magazine. When the store opened its first proper consignment morning 2 weeks later, we had 11 makers represented and 42 products on the shelves. Mrs. Rosa came in at 7:30 carrying 28 jars of hot sauce in a recycled tote bag, and she arranged them on the shelf herself, adjusting each one so the label faced perfectly outward with the focused care of someone presenting something they had made with their hands and their time and their particular knowledge of what a pepper could become if you treated it right. Her product card read, Rosa Delgado, made from my grandmother's recipe, one batch at a time. This neighborhood has been my home for 31 years. By 11 o'clock, every jar was gone. I was at the counter helping a woman select a candle when Mrs. Rosa appeared at my elbow and tugged my sleeve. I turned to look at her, and the expression on her face stopped me completely. Her eyes were wet, her chin trembling, her free hand pressed flat against her chest. "They're all sold," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word, splitting wide open. "Every single one. I've never, in 30 years of making this, nobody ever—" She pressed her lips together hard and her eyes spilled over, and she let them, standing right there in the middle of the store with her empty tote bag in one hand and tears running freely down her face. "My grandmother taught me that recipe," she said. "She said someday someone would appreciate it. I thought she was just being kind." I reached out and held both her hands in mine. My own throat was too full to speak properly. I squeezed her fingers and she squeezed back hard, and we stood there together, two women in a small store on a block most of the city had forgotten existed, and neither of us needed to say anything else. Arthur had filmed all of it from across the room, not intrusively, just present the way he always was when something real was happening. That evening he showed me his screen. The clip, 4 minutes of the morning's first sales, Mrs. Rosa arranging her jars, the product cards, the customers, and 30 seconds of Mrs. Rosa crying and saying my grandmother taught me that recipe had been live for 6 hours. 40,000 views. He scrolled through the comments. This is the most beautiful thing I've seen this year. Where is this store I'm driving there tomorrow? Someone finally doing something real. Arthur looked up at me. He was trying not to smile too wide the way he did when something exceeded what he had let himself hope for. It's starting, he said. By the following morning, the clip had 400,000 views. I found out at 6 a.m. when Arthur came out of the bedroom already dressed, his phone in one hand and an expression on his face I had not seen since the night he proposed, a kind of lit-up, barely contained energy that he was working very hard to keep from becoming something embarrassing. 400,000? He said, holding the screen toward me. I took his phone, read the number, set it back down on the kitchen counter, and picked up my coffee cup with both hands because I needed something solid to hold. That's not possible, I said. A food account in Portland with 80,000 followers shared it last night, he said. Then a local community page, then someone in Chicago with 300,000. It kept going after that. He paused. People are leaving their addresses in the comments. They want to know where the store is. Tell them, I said. What happened over the following 3 weeks was not something I had planned for, because the truth was, I had not planned for anything beyond surviving. The common table's consignment model had been built on the logic of a neighborhood small, specific, contained. What Arthur had filmed and released into the world was something much harder to contain: a story. A real one with real people and real stakes, and the particular quality of truth that audiences trained on polished content recognize immediately, the way a human ear trained on recorded music will always hear the difference when someone plays live. The regional news affiliate in Portland picked it up on a Wednesday. A reporter named Dana Kowalski spent an afternoon in the store with a cameraman filming Mrs. Rosa restocking her sauce shelf and old James fitting a new crossbeam to the shelving unit near the entrance that had been wobbling since day one. The segment ran at 6 o'clock and opened with a shot of the hand-lettered common table sign above the door and a voiceover that began, "In a neighborhood most of Portland passes without stopping, something unusual is happening." By Thursday morning, the store's social media following, which Arthur had quietly been building for 2 months, had crossed 120,000. By the following Monday, the clip of Mrs. Rosa saying my grandmother taught me that recipe had been viewed, according to Arthur's analytics dashboard, 2,300,000 times. 2 million. I stood in front of the store the morning that number appeared on Arthur's screen and felt something I did not immediately have a name for. Not pride exactly, something quieter and more disorienting than pride. The feeling of building something small in a room with your hands and watching it somehow become visible to people you had never met in cities you had never been to, who were responding to it in ways you could not have anticipated because you had never imagined anyone would be looking. The neighborhood felt it too. People showed up in ways that had no formal arrangement behind them. Frank from the laundromat started keeping an eye on the store entrance during the hours Arthur and I both had to be elsewhere, and he did this without being asked and without making it a thing. The 3 older men who sat in the lawn chairs at the corner began positioning themselves where they could see the front door, and when a news van double parked once and blocked our supply delivery, one of them walked over and had a quiet word with the driver that resolved the situation in under 2 minutes. Mrs. Rosa began arriving every morning 30 minutes before we opened, not to restock her shelf, restocked twice a week now, but simply to be there. She never said it was protection. She just arrived with coffee and stayed. Meridian Recovery Group's communication had shifted since the dispute notice. Their letters came regularly formally, and within the boundaries of what the law required: no more unannounced visits, no more pressure calls at 6 in the morning. But it was not until the fourth week of the viral attention that something different happened. A man came into the store on a Tuesday afternoon dressed in the same dark jacket as the four who had stood at my door 6 weeks earlier. But his posture was different. He bought a jar of Mrs. Rose's hot sauce. He stood at the counter while I rang it up, and just before he left, he said without quite looking at me, "For what it's worth, we received the fraud dispute documentation last week. Legal is reviewing it. That's all I can tell you." Then he walked out. I watched him go. Behind me, Walter, who had been reorganizing the back shelf, and who had been, I now understood, paying very close attention to everything, said nothing. But when I turned around, there was something in his expression that looked for just a moment like satisfaction. The contract offer from a regional distribution company called Pacific Goods arrived on a Friday afternoon, forwarded by email through a business contact of Arthur's, who had seen the news segment. The proposed terms were preliminary, a partnership rather than acquisition, allowing the common table to retain its brand identity and maker relationships, while accessing a distribution network that reached 37 stores across the Pacific Northwest. The advance they were proposing was enough to cover the next 18 months of operations and make a significant first payment against the documented debt. Arthur and I sat at the back office desk until 11 that night, going through every clause. By the end, we had a list of 12 amendments we would ask for, and 2 terms we would not move on. Arthur poured 2 glasses of water, handed me one, and said, "We should sleep before we respond. Good decisions need rest behind them." I agreed. I shut the laptop. Then my phone rang. An international number, a country code I recognized after a moment as France. I answered because not answering had already cost me more than I could afford. "Sienna." The voice on the other end was my brother's, and it sounded like nothing I had ever heard from him before. Garrett Fry, who had never once in 38 years allowed anyone to hear fear in his voice, was afraid. "Sienna, I need money. I need it now. You have to help me." I sat very still for a moment. Outside the office window, the store was quiet and dark, the common table sign casting a faint rectangle of light on the sidewalk. "Tell me what happened," I said. Garrett talked for 11 minutes. I sat in the dark of the back office and listened to my brother explain in a voice I had never heard from him before, thin, rushed, stripped of everything he had always used to fill it, that an investment he had made in a European real estate development fund had gone wrong. Significantly wrong. He used words like liquidity crisis and temporary setback and institutional irregularities in the practiced way of someone who had spent the last several weeks telling the story to people he needed things from, but underneath the vocabulary, what he was actually saying was much simpler. The money was gone. "How much?" I asked. A pause. "Most of it." "How much of most?" Another pause, longer this time. "All of it," he said. "Sienna, I just need to get through the next 60 days. If you could—" "Garrett." My voice came out steady. Not unkind. Just steady. "I don't have money to lend you. I have a debt with my name on it that I am working to repay 1 month at a time. You know that. But the store, I've seen the news. The store is not a cash reserve," I said. "And even if it were, this conversation would be the same." I let that sit for a moment. "I'm sorry you're in trouble. I genuinely am. But I can't help you the way you're asking." The silence on his end was long enough that I checked the call was still connected. "Fine," he said finally. The fear in his voice had curdled into something harder. "Fine." He hung up. I set the phone down on the desk and sat in the dark for a while, not moving, not thinking about anything in particular. Just breathing. Then I stood up, turned the light on, and went back to work. The Pacific Goods contract finalized 10 days later. Their lead negotiator was a woman named Sandra Palmer, a sharp, efficient presence who did not waste words and respected when the other person did the same. We met twice, in their Portland office, Arthur beside me with his own annotated copy of the draft, and we held on the two terms I had told Arthur we would not move on the common table, retained full brand ownership, and the right to continue direct maker relationships, independent of the distribution agreement. After 40 minutes of discussion on the second day, Sandra set her pen down and said, "We can work with that." She signed. I signed. The advance 40% of the contract value paid on execution landed in the business account 4 days later. It was the first time in almost a year that I had looked at a bank balance and felt something other than dread. That same afternoon, Arthur spread a printed document across the back office desk. It was a list of every debt holder who had been assigned our obligations through Meridian's network, 8 separate entities, in total ranging from a consumer debt fund in Oregon to a collection agency operating out of Nevada. "I found it through the credit bureau dispute filings," he said. "Everything's on record. These are the people holding the paper." I studied the list for a long time. In the context of what we now had, the advance, the distribution revenue projections, the fraud documentation from the safe, the list looked different than it would have a year ago. Not like a wall, more like a series of doors, each one requiring a specific key. Debt buyers, I had learned through 6 months of necessity, did not hold bad debt out of sentiment. They held it for return on investment. And when a better return presented itself, when someone offered 20 cents on the dollar for a disputed obligation that might otherwise take years to collect, the decision was largely mathematical. "I want to start with the Nevada agency," I said. "They have the smallest position and the highest rate. If we buy that one first, the others will see we're serious." Arthur looked at me for a moment. "You're going to buy back the debt?" "All of it," I said. "Eventually. Not with their money. Mine." He leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone revising an already high estimate upward. "Okay," he said. "Let's run the numbers." Walter Cole came in the next morning the same way he always had, quietly, without announcement, at 7 a.m. with his own broom. But he did not sweep. He stood in the middle of the store and looked around slowly, the way a person looks at a room they are committing to memory. Then he looked at me. "You don't need me anymore," he said. It was not a question. I felt something catch in my throat. "That's not—" "It's all right," he said. "It's how it was supposed to go." He set the broom against the counter, our broom, the new one we had bought in month 2, and straightened his jacket. "Your grandfather asked me to tell you something for when this moment arrived." He paused. "He said you did it exactly right, every step." My eyes burned. I pressed the back of my wrist against them hard and breathed through it. "Where will you go?" I asked. "Not far," he said. And then he walked out the front door and the bell rang once above it, and that was the last time I saw Walter Cole. I stood at the counter for a long moment after he left, one hand resting on the surface of it, feeling the grain of the wood Natalie had refinished and old James had sanded. Around me, the store held its own quiet, the good kind, the kind that comes from a space that has been lived in and worked in and cried in and laughed in enough that it has started to accumulate something more than air. 2 days later, Arthur came into the office with his laptop and set it open in front of me without preamble. A legal notice filed in a French court. The villa in Provence that had been transferred into Garrett's name 3 years ago, the one my parents had used as the foundation of their European life, had been seized by a French lending institution on the basis of unpaid obligations against the property. The court date was 3 weeks prior. The outcome was a matter of public record. It was gone. I read the document twice. Then I closed the laptop carefully and looked at the wall above the desk where Arthur had taped a photograph of the store's first market day. 42 people, 4 tables, 1 idea. I thought about my brother's voice on the phone, the fear in it, the thinness. I did not feel satisfied. I did not feel vindicated. I felt mostly tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for so long that when it finally shifts, you don't know what to do with your hands. "What happens now?" Arthur asked. "They come home," I said. "And when they do, they come here." The story is reaching a point of no return. Before I reveal the shocking truth about what actually happened to my family in France, please comment on the number 88 so I know you're still here with me. Also, please note the upcoming events include some fictionalized elements to enhance the narrative. If this isn't for you, feel free to skip the rest of the video here. I did not learn what had happened in France all at once. It came in pieces the way bad news usually does. A fragment here, a document there, a phone call from someone who knew someone who had been involved in the legal proceedings. Arthur compiled it the way he compiled everything methodically and without editorializing, and by the end of October, we had a picture that was complete enough to understand. Garrett had arrived in France 2.5 years earlier with confidence and capital and very little working knowledge of European investment law. He had been introduced through a network of expatriate business contacts to a fund called Continental Horizon Partners, a private real estate development vehicle operating out of Nice, with a prospectus that promised consistent returns of 18% annually through commercial property acquisitions along the Côte d'Azur. The offices were real. The brochures were real. The lawyers who processed the investment agreements were real. The underlying properties were not. Continental Horizon Partners was in the language of the French Financial Crimes Authority that had been investigating it for 14 months before Garrett ever signed a document of sophisticated investment fraud money in nothing, out a small and dwindling pool of early investors subsidized by later ones, until the structure could no longer sustain itself. By the time Garrett wired his capital across, the fund was already in its final year. He had invested $8 million into something that had been dying for longer than he had known it existed. The man whose name appeared buried on page 47 of the fund's original incorporation documents as a silent founding partner was Martin Hale. I sat with that name for a long time. Arthur pulled up what he had found on Hale, a businessman in his late 70s, originally from Cincinnati, who had spent 30 years moving between American and European financial circles. He had a long paper trail of civil disputes and regulatory notices, none of them individually serious enough to result in charges, all of them together, forming the portrait of a man who operated at the edge of legality with the practiced ease of long experience. He had done business with my grandfather once, 22 years ago. The partnership had ended badly, a dispute over a property deal in which Hale had, according to a civil court filing, Arthur found in the Oregon Public Records, attempted to misrepresent the title status of a commercial building in Portland. Silas Fry had caught it withdrawn from the deal and filed a formal complaint with the State Real Estate Commission. Hale had lost his Oregon license. 22 years later, when a man named Garrett Fry had walked into Continental Horizon Partners with $8 million and the confidence of someone who had never had a reason to be cautious. What we pieced together later was that Douglas had always known about the safe. Silas had built it during the years they worked together, and Douglas had seen it once, years before the falling out. He had not taken the documents before leaving because he had not believed his father would use them. That miscalculation had cost him 3 years. He didn't target Garrett specifically, Arthur said, reading from his notes. The fund was already running, but when a Fry walked in the door, he paused. He didn't slow down to be careful. Garrett lost everything within 6 months. What happened next was Elena, my sister-in-law, whom I had met perhaps a dozen times over the years, and who had always struck me as someone who kept very precise accounts of what she was owed by the world, had apparently spent the years in France building a parallel financial life with the same quiet thoroughness that I had been building the store. While Garrett attended networking dinners and convinced himself the returns would materialize, Elena had been moving through the luxury spending of someone who understood on some level that the income would not hold. When Continental Horizon collapsed, and the full extent of what Garrett had lost became clear, Elena had already pledged the villa. The Lion Bank had filed a separate criminal complaint against Elena with the French authorities. That process was running on its own timeline in a country neither of us had any stake in following. A mortgage against the property signed in her name and Garrett's, except that Garrett's signature had been replicated from his identification documents without his presence or knowledge. The loan amount was €600,000 secured against a property they did not own outright, obtained from a private lending institution in Lyon that had not looked as carefully at the documentation as they should have. When the French bank called about the missed payment, Garrett answered the phone thinking it was a routine administrative matter. It was not. The confrontation between them, according to what I pieced together later from a brief and furious conversation Garrett had with our mother that she eventually relayed to me, had lasted 4 hours and ended with Elena leaving for Paris and not coming back. Garrett had spent 3 days in a hotel room before calling a French attorney, who had spent 3 more days reviewing the situation before advising him that his options were limited, his exposure was significant, and that his best immediate course of action was to cooperate with the bank's process rather than contest it. My parents liquidated what remained. An investment account in Switzerland, the last remnant of the assets they had moved before leaving Portland, went to pay Garrett's immediate legal fees and the outstanding balance on Elena's fraudulent loan. The villa was surrendered to the bank. A small amount of cash enough for 4 plane tickets and 2 months of modest living came back to the United States with them. 4 tickets. Douglas, Vivian, Garrett, and Elena, who had apparently decided that whatever damage she had caused, it was still preferable to facing it alone in Paris. I read Arthur's summary twice. Then I folded it and put it in the folder with everything else. "Are you all right?" Arthur asked. "I'm tired," I said honestly. Not surprised, just tired. He sat beside me on the office couch and did not say anything for a moment. Then he put his arm around me and I leaned into it and we stayed like that, while the store settled into its evening quiet around us, the refrigerator humming the common table sign casting its familiar glow onto the sidewalk outside. I had spent 3 years watching the consequences of other people's choices catch up to them. I had not expected it to feel like this. Not victory, not relief. Just the particular exhaustion of someone who has been right about something for a very long time and finds that being right in the end is the least interesting part of the story. My phone rang at 8:45, a Portland number I did not recognize. Sienna, my father's voice, controlled but only just I could hear underneath the familiar steadiness the effort it was costing him. "We need to talk. About the store." I looked at Arthur. He looked at me. "Come by tomorrow morning," I said. 9 o'clock. I hung up and set the phone on the desk. "Tomorrow," Arthur said. "Tomorrow," I confirmed. I made coffee that morning the way I always did when I needed something ordinary to stand behind. Measured, unhurried 2 cups for Arthur and 1 for me, the routine of it a kind of anchor, while everything else moved around it. Arthur came into the kitchen at 8:30 and stood beside me without speaking for a moment, watching me pour. Then he said, "How are you feeling?" "Ready," I said, and I meant it. Whatever happened in the next hour, I had been preparing for it for 3 years in ways I was only beginning to understand myself. They arrived at 9:05. Not in the car, I remembered, that was gone, along with most of what had funded it. They came in a cab, the 3 of them, my father and mother and brother, filing up the front walk with the particular dignity of people who have decided not to let being reduced show. Douglas wore a jacket I recognized from 5 years ago. Vivian had her hair done, which told me everything I needed to know about how she had chosen to frame this visit in her own mind. Garrett walked behind them, both his hands in his pockets, his eyes moving across the front of our house with an expression I could not fully read. I opened the door before they knocked. "Come in," I said. They settled in the living room, my parents on the sofa, Garrett in the armchair to the left. Arthur sat in the chair by the window, his coffee in hand, saying nothing, watching everything. I sat across from my parents and waited. Douglas took his time. He looked around the room first with the practiced assessment of a man who has always believed that understanding the space he occupies gives him an advantage in it. Then he folded his hands together and looked at me. "We've been through a difficult period," he said. "I know," I said. France was things didn't go the way we anticipated. He paused. But we're home now, and the family needs to come back together. That's what matters. I said nothing. I had learned in 3 years of running a business and managing debt and negotiating contracts that silence is not a concession. It is a tool. I let it sit in the room and watched him decide what to do with it. The store has done well, he continued. Really well, Sienna. We've seen the coverage. What you've built, it's impressive. Genuinely. He leaned forward slightly. But it's a family asset. It came from family. And right now, Garrett needs a foundation to rebuild from. Something stable. Something with your name behind it, behind all our names. He spread his hands. It makes sense for him to take a leadership role. You could stay involved. We're not saying walk away. We're saying come back to being a family. I looked at my father. At the slight forward angle of his posture, the controlled reasonableness of his voice, the way he was using the word family, the way someone uses a key they are hoping still fits the lock. Then my mother spoke. Sienna. Vivian's voice was softer than Douglas's, a different instrument entirely designed for different work. You have Arthur. You have your life, your home. You've done so well, you really have nobody's taking that away. Her eyes were warm in the way that had always made me feel as a child like I was being seen, and that I had only later understood was not warmth at all, but focus, the particular attention of someone measuring the distance between you and where they need you to be. But your brother is family. My son. He made mistakes, yes. But he's your blood. You can't look at him sitting there and tell me it doesn't mean something. I looked at Garrett. He was looking at the floor. His jaw was working slightly, and when he felt my gaze, he looked up. For a moment, something moved across his face, not the calculation I expected, not the performance of remorse that I had been braced for, but something rawer than either of those. Something that looked almost like exhaustion. The particular tiredness of a man who has been holding a version of himself up for a very long time and is not sure how much longer he can manage it. I don't want to fight, he said. His voice was quiet. I'm not here to fight Sienna. I know, I said. He stopped, pressed his lips together. I don't have anything left, he said. That's all. That's the whole truth of it. And the strange thing, the thing I had not anticipated sitting across from the person who had among other actions ordered men to break into my store and rip up my floors, was that I believed him. Not enough to give him what he was asking for, but enough to feel the weight of it land. I hear you, I said. Douglas must have read something in that some small opening because he straightened up and his voice took on the boardroom tone again. So we're agreed that we'll discuss the transition. I didn't say that, I said. He stopped. I said I hear him. I looked at my father steadily. That's different. The room was quiet. Vivian's expression shifted, the warmth withdrawing, replaced by something brittle and assessing. Douglas sat back. We're family, he said again, this time without the reasonableness behind it. I know, I said. Let me think about it. I showed them to the door at 10:15. They walked back to the waiting cab in a silence that felt different from the one they had arrived in, heavier, more uncertain, like people who had come expecting a door to open and found instead that it required a key they did not have. When their cab pulled away from the curb, Arthur appeared at my shoulder. You don't need more time, he said. It was not a question. I watched the cab reach the corner and turn. No, I said. I don't. My father stared at the folder. It sat on the counter between us, cream-colored, unremarkable, the kind of folder that holds receipts or warranties or documents no one thinks about until they suddenly matter enormously. Douglas Fry looked at it the way a man looks at something he does not recognize but suspects he should, and I watched the certainty in his face shift just slightly, the way ice shifts before it cracks. What is that? He asked again. I told you, I said. The beginning of a very long overdue conversation. I kept my hand resting on the cover, relaxed, unhurried. Why don't we step into the office? It was the calmness that did it, I think. He had expected resistance argument, tears, the kind of emotional response that gives a person something to push against. What he got instead was this: his daughter standing behind her own counter in her own store, speaking to him with the measured composure of someone who has already decided every word before she says it. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear, not yet, but the early uncomfortable suspicion that the room had changed while he was not paying attention. Garrett had moved to the far end of the counter where two of our part-time staff, a young man named Derek and a woman named Louise, were pretending to inventory the end display. He was speaking to them in the low, authoritative tone of someone who assumes their instructions will be followed, something about reorganizing the floor plan, something about his role going forward. Derek looked at Louise. Louise looked at Derek. Neither of them moved. "Excuse me," Louise said politely. "We take direction from Ms. Fry." Garrett turned toward me. Something hardened in his expression. My mother had not been idle. Vivian had drifted toward the center of the store where four of our regular customers, including Mrs. Rosa, who had arrived that morning with a fresh delivery, and who, had I suspected no intention of leaving, were watching with the focused attention of people who understood they were witnessing something. "You should all know," Vivian said to the room generally with the bright, carrying voice of a woman accustomed to being listened to at charity luncheons, "that this store was built on the foundation of a family business. Our family. And we're simply here to make sure it continues under the right management." Mrs. Rosa set down the jar she was holding with a deliberate click that said more than most sentences. "I've been coming to this store since the day it opened," she said in the quiet, even tone of someone choosing their words because they mean each of them. "I know who built it, and it wasn't you." Vivian turned to look at her with an expression that had not been challenged this directly in some time. Her composure held, but at a cost that was becoming visible around the edges. Douglas stepped forward. He was done with the reasonable approach. Now I could see the moment he decided it. The slight squaring of his shoulders, the way his voice dropped into the register of someone who has decided that authority asserted firmly enough will substitute for whatever he no longer has. "Sienna." His voice cut across the store. "You are my daughter. This started with our name, our history, our connections. Without the Fry name behind you, none of this—" He gestured broadly at the shelves, at the hand-lettered signs, at the photographs of our makers on the wall. "Exists. You don't get to take something that belongs to a family and call it yours." The store had gone still, not silent. The refrigerator hummed. Traffic moved outside. A child, somewhere in the back, asked his mother a question, but the human noise of it had quieted into something attentive. Arthur was standing 3 feet to my right, his arms loose at his sides, watching my father the way he watched everything, calmly, completely. Then Vivian turned to me and her voice changed, the luncheon brightness falling away, replaced by something with more edges. "You have always been selfish, Sienna, even as a little girl. Everything your father and I did, every sacrifice we made, every door we opened, and you look at your brother sitting here with nothing, and you stand behind that counter like it doesn't concern you." Her chin lifted. "I raised you better than this. I carried you. I gave you everything. And this is what you do with it." My chest tightened. Not from grief, I knew this script too well for grief, but from the sheer breathtaking audacity of the performance, the way a person can look you in the eye and revise history so completely that they appear to believe it themselves. Garrett came to stand beside our parents. He was not the kneeling, exhausted man from our living room the day before. He had put his armor back on overnight, or a version of it thinner than it used to be, held together with less certainty but present. "Nobody's saying you didn't work hard," he said. "But there's a difference between what you built and what belongs to the family. You know that." The 3 of them stood in a line across the store floor, and I looked at each of them in turn. My father's controlled anger, my mother's wounded performance, my brother's borrowed conviction, and I felt something settle into place inside me, with the quiet, final precision of a key turning in a lock. Douglas stepped to the counter. He placed both palms flat on the surface, leaned forward, and looked at me with the face of a man who has decided he has run out of patience. "Sign the papers over," he said. "Transfer the management rights to Garrett. We've had them drawn up. You walk away with your reputation intact, your life intact, and this family moves forward. Or," his jaw tightened, "we take this to court today and make it considerably more complicated for everyone." The store waited. I looked at my father's hands flat on the counter, the same hands that had signed documents in my name without asking, that had built a structure of lies over 15 years and called it family. And I felt for the first time all morning the particular warmth of knowing exactly what comes next. I smiled. It surprised him. I could tell by the way his posture shifted, a small, involuntary lean back, a recalibration. "Funny," I said. "I have paperwork too." I opened the folder. Not with drama, not with the grand gesture the moment might have invited. I simply lifted the cover, turned it toward the counter, and laid the first document flat in the space between my father's hands and mine. It was a debt assignment agreement. Two parties listed at the top, the seller a Nevada-based debt collection agency called Westline Asset Recovery, and the buyer. The buyer's name was printed in clean black type in the designated field, Sienna Fry. My father looked at the document. His eyes moved from the header to the figures in the middle to the name at the bottom. I watched the color in his face change, not all at once, but in stages, like something draining out slowly through a crack he had not known was there. "That's not," he started. "There are 8 of them," I said. "One for each agency holding a position on the debt you left in my name." I laid the next document on top of the first, then the next. 8 agreements, 8 signatures, 8 debt portfolios that had changed hands over the course of 3 years through legally documented transfers. Westline Asset Recovery, Pacific Debt Holdings, Consolidated Credit Services. I said each name as I placed the page. I contacted each of them. I offered 20 cents on the dollar for the full face value of the obligations. Every one of them accepted. They made their margin, and I became the only person your debt was owed to. The store had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that is not empty but held people deliberately making space for something to unfold. "What are you saying?" Garrett's voice came out thinner than he intended. He was standing very still, his earlier confidence evaporated, replaced by something that looked like the beginning of a cold understanding settling in. "I'm saying your father owes me $10,240,000, I said. "Plus 3 years of accrued interest at the rates specified in the original loan agreements." I looked at Douglas, which he signed. Arthur stepped forward from where he had been standing and placed a printed summary sheet on top of the stack. A single page, clearly organized total at the bottom in bold. Douglas stared at it. His jaw was working, the muscle in his cheek jumping in the way it did when he was processing something he had not prepared for. He looked up at me. His eyes had changed. The controlled authority was still there, but underneath it now was something else. Something raw and unsteady that I had never seen on my father's face before. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, and his voice had lost its boardroom quality. It was just a voice now, just a man's voice. "I understand exactly what I'm doing," I said. "Let me be clear about the choice in front of you, because I want there to be no confusion." I kept my voice even the way Richard Holt had kept his voice, even in that empty office 3 years ago, placing each word carefully. "Option 1, you acknowledge the debt, agree to a repayment structure, and we handle this privately. Option 2. I reached into the folder and produced a second set of documents, thicker, the edges aligned with the precision of something that had been organized and reorganized many times. "I deliver this package to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit." I set it on the counter beside the debt agreements. This contains 3 years of documented evidence. Wire transfer records showing funds moved through shell companies registered in my name without my knowledge or consent, that is identity theft and wire fraud under federal law. Tax filings showing income that was never reported routed through those same entities. 20 years of financial records. I paused. Your name is on all of it. Vivian made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a breath. Something in between. Her hand went to her collarbone, the first unguarded gesture I had ever seen from her, and she looked at Douglas with an expression I had no framework for, because I had never seen her look at him that way before. Not imploring, not manipulating, just frightened. Garrett sat down in one of the chairs near the window. He did not do it deliberately, his legs simply stopped supporting the weight of what he had just heard. He sat there with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he did not say a word. The debt you think you left me, I said to my father, was never real. You built it from nothing to trap me. I know that. You know that. But the documentation I have, every company, every transfer, every signature is real. And right now, I'm the person who holds both. I let that sit. What I'm offering you is a choice. One you don't deserve, but one I'm giving you anyway. Douglas straightened. His hands went flat on the counter, the gesture so familiar from task 1 that it felt almost rehearsed, the reach for authority, when authority is the only tool left. You're threatening your own family, he said. No, I said. I'm offering you the same courtesy you never offered me, a warning before the consequences arrive. He opened his mouth. The anger that had been building in him since the moment I opened the folder was finally reaching the surface, and I could see it coming. The voice raised the accusation, the last resort performance of a man who has no remaining moves but refuses to accept it. And then the door to the back office opened. Arthur stepped through the doorway with his laptop open in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. He did not hurry. He never hurried when the situation was serious. It was one of the things I had loved about him from the beginning. The way he moved through high-pressure moments with the deliberate calm of someone who understood that urgency performed rather than felt is mostly theater. He set the laptop on the counter, angled the screen toward my parents, and looked at my father. There's more, he said simply. Douglas looked at Arthur the way people look at things they have decided to discount. A son-in-law, background, furniture. He had made that assessment of Arthur 3 years into our marriage and had never revised it, which was one of the most significant miscalculations of a life built on miscalculation. The physical documents Sienna mentioned, the corporate records, the transfer histories, those are the foundation, Arthur said, opening the envelope and removing a printed timeline, clean and organized with dates running in a column down the left margin. But they don't stand alone. They're corroborated. He turned the laptop screen fully toward the room. This is a voicemail, he said, left on Sienna's phone 14 months after you left the country. He pressed play. My father's voice came out of the speaker, familiar, unhurried, the boardroom voice he used when he believed he was in control of a conversation. The message was 6 weeks old by the time I had understood what I was hearing in it. He had called to inform me in the measured tones of someone conveying administrative information that the debt obligations would be reviewed in due course, and that he expected cooperation from all relevant parties. He had not said fraud. He had not said, I arranged this, or I signed your name, or any of the explicit sentences that would have made the recording simple and complete. But he had said in the fourth sentence, with the specificity of a man who knew the details because he had created them, the companies under your name were structured that way for legitimate tax purposes, and any suggestion otherwise would be very difficult to substantiate. The companies under your name, structured that way. I watched my father's expression as he heard his own words played back to him. He did not move, not a flinch, not a blink, just a stillness that was different from composure, the stillness of a person who has walked into a room and realized too late that the room was a trap. There are 4 voicemails, Arthur said, across 3 years. Each of them references in different ways knowledge of the corporate structures and the debt instruments. None of them are explicit. All of them, in context with the documentary evidence, are significant. He paused. Our attorney's word, not mine. Your attorney, my mother repeated. Her voice had gone thin. Howard Aldrich, I said. He was a partner at a firm downtown for 30 years before he retired. He and my grandfather were close friends for most of that time. He's been reviewing our complete file for 6 months. I looked at my mother steadily. He describes the evidence as... I glanced at Arthur. Substantial, Arthur said. That's the exact word he used. Substantial and well documented. Vivian pressed her fingers against her lips. Her eyes were wet, and I could see her trying to hold the expression, the wounded, dignified performance that had served her for 60 years, but whatever mechanism usually held it in place had stopped working. Her chin trembled. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. And then, in a way that surprised me, even after everything, she started to cry, not the delicate strategic tears I had seen her deploy at family dinners and difficult conversations, but something messier and less controlled, a grief that came from somewhere real, even if I could not be sure what it was grieving. She started. I never wanted it to be like this. Vivian. Douglas's voice was quiet, warning. I never wanted any of this, she said, and the words broke apart in her mouth. I just did what he said to do. I didn't ask where the money came from. I didn't ask how the papers were. She pressed her hands flat against her face. I looked at my mother and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not forgiveness, I was nowhere near that, and I was not sure I ever would be, but a kind of sad recognition. The architecture of a marriage in which one person gives orders and the other follows them, and by the time the consequences arrive, neither of them remembers exactly where the line between complicity and obedience fell. Then there was a sound from across the room. Garrett had stood up. He was not looking at any of us. He was looking at the front door of the store, and his jaw was tight, and there was something in his face that was beyond shame, beyond anger, somewhere on the other side of both of those things, where there is nothing left but the bare fact of what you have done and who you are. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the frame. He stopped there for a moment, and I thought he was going to turn around, and if he had, I think something might have been different. But he didn't turn around. He pushed the door open, and the bell above it rang once, and he walked out into the morning. The store settled. Douglas had not spoken since the voicemail. He sat on the stool Arthur had placed at the counter for him, both hands in his lap, and the look on his face was the most honest thing I had ever seen on it. Not anger, not calculation, not the performance of authority. Just a man looking at what he had built and understanding perhaps for the first time what it actually was. Arthur closed the laptop. There's one more thing, he said. He looked not at my parents but at the door that led to the back room, the room beyond the office, the one with the access to the rear of the building. His voice was steady and quiet. Someone wants to speak with the family. My mother looked up. My father's eyes moved slowly toward the door. The handle turned. The man who stepped through that door was 81 years old, and he moved like it slowly with the careful economy of someone who has learned to spend energy wisely. His white hair was combed. His cardigan was the same gray one he had worn the afternoon we sat together in his small apartment 3 years ago, when he pressed a rusted key into my hand and told me to look at what people lacked. My mother saw him first. The sound she made was not a word. It was something before language, a sharp, broken intake of breath that seemed to pull the air out of the room. She rose halfway from her stool and then stopped, caught between the impulse to move and some deeper paralysis, her hands gripping the counter edge, her face stripped of everything she had ever used to protect it. "Silas," she whispered. My grandfather looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at my father. Douglas Fry had gone very still. He was looking at his father, the man who had built the company from nothing. The man whose name was on the door of the first office Douglas had ever walked into. the man whose approval he had spent decades performing for, and ultimately decided he no longer needed, and something in his face was doing something I had never seen it do before. It was coming apart. Not dramatically, not with tears or noise, but in the quiet, structural way of something that has been under pressure for so long that when the pressure finally lifts, the shape simply goes. Silas crossed the store floor and stopped a few feet from the counter. He looked around the space slowly at the hand-lettered signs, at the photographs of makers on the wall, at Mrs. Rose's sauce display, at the morning light coming through the front window, and something moved across his face that was softer than satisfaction and more complicated than pride. "I've been watching this," he said to no one in particular, "for a long time." He looked at me then, and I felt my throat close. "You did more than I expected," he said, "and I expected a great deal." I pressed my knuckles hard against my mouth and breathed through it. Behind me, I felt Arthur's hand settle lightly on my shoulder, just there, just present, and I anchored myself to that. Silas turned to his son. Douglas had not moved. He was sitting on his stool with his hands in his lap, and he was looking at his father with the face of a 63-year-old man who is in this moment much younger than that a boy caught in something he cannot explain in a room where all the exits have quietly closed. "I've been in a building on the same block for 3 years, under a name that wasn't mine, in a room you would never have thought to look in." He paused. "I watched what you sent after her. The agencies. The men you hired to break in here. I watched what she did in response to each of those things." He looked at Douglas steadily. "I wanted to intervene several times. Mr. Cole talked me out of it." A small pause. "He was right to." My father opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "I left 24 hours before the villa transfer completed," Silas said. "You had arranged it so that the building would be in Garrett's name, and I would be what A guest, A courtesy, A man, with no claim to the thing he built." His voice was even, entirely devastatingly even. "I am too old for that kind of arrangement." He reached into the breast pocket of his cardigan and produced something small, a photograph torn along one ragged edge. He set it on the counter and smoothed it flat with one hand. It was a family portrait. I recognized it immediately. It had hung in the hallway of my grandparents' house for as long as I could remember. My grandfather, younger by decades, standing in front of a building that I now recognized as this building. My father beside him, perhaps 30 years old, his hand on his father's shoulder. And at the very edge of the torn line, just visible, the small arm and partial face of a child. Me. "I took your half," Silas said to me without turning from Douglas. "The half with you in it. The half with your father." He touched the torn edge lightly. "I left behind, in the villa, so he would understand when he found it." He looked up at Douglas. "Did you find it?" he asked. My father's jaw moved. His hands still in his lap were shaking. Not the controlled tremor of exhaustion, but something deeper, something that came from the center of a person when the story they have told themselves for 60 years finally reaches its last page. "Yes," Douglas said. His voice was barely sound. "Did you understand?" A silence that was different from all the other silences in that room. Then quietly, without looking up, "Yes." My mother had stopped crying. She was sitting very straight on her stool, her hands folded in her lap, her face utterly still, not composed, but emptied the way a room looks after everyone has left it. Silas stood in front of his son for a long moment. I watched him, the set of his shoulders, the steadiness of his hands, the way his face held something that was not anger and not forgiveness, but the particular expression of a man who has grieved something for a very long time and has simply come to the end of the grieving. "I gave you a life," he said. "A good one. Built from work and principle and things I believed were worth the cost of building." He looked at Douglas directly. "You used it to destroy. Not all at once. In small choices over many years, each one easier than the last because none of them felt in the moment like the thing that they were adding up to. He paused. I know how that happens. I am your father. I know you. Douglas pressed his lips together hard. His eyes were bright. I'm not here to punish you, Silas said. The law will manage what the law manages. I'm here because there is something I should have done a long time ago and did not, and I intend to do it now. He reached into the inside pocket of his cardigan and produced a thick envelope, heavy official sealed with the embossed mark of a law firm I did not recognize. He set it on the counter beside the torn photograph. This is the last thing I need to do, he said. Howard Aldrich had been in the back room since 8:30 that morning. He was 74 years old, gray-haired with the deliberate movements of a man who had spent 5 decades in law and understood that the weight of a moment is rarely improved by rushing it. He carried the second envelope larger than the one Silas had produced, bearing the embossed seal of his firm under one arm, and he set it on the counter beside the torn photograph with the careful precision of someone placing the final piece of something that had taken a very long time to build. Mr. and Mrs. Fry, he said, looking at my parents. My name is Howard Aldrich. I've served as counsel to Silas Fry for the better part of 30 years. What I'm about to explain concerns a legal instrument he established 11 years ago. He opened the envelope. The Fry Family Trust. My mother looked at the document like she was looking at something in a language she had always been meant to speak and had somehow never learned. Howard spread the pages on the counter clean, organized the kind of document that has been reviewed and refined over years until every word is exactly the word it needs to be. He did not read it verbatim. He summarized the way a good lawyer summarizes clearly without embellishment, without mercy. The trust had been established to hold the primary assets of the Fry family line, including this building, certain financial instruments and property interests accumulated over 30 years of Silas Fry's working life. The terms of the trust included what was formally called a conduct clause, a provision entirely legal and increasingly common in American estate planning that made continued participation in the trust's benefits contingent on the beneficiary's conduct meeting a defined standard: fraud, financial crimes, identity theft, actions taken to harm a fellow beneficiary. Any documented instance of such conduct, Howard said, triggers automatic disinheritance of the responsible party. No court action required beyond the initial filing of documentation with the trust administrator. He looked at my father. The documentation has been filed. As of this morning, Douglas and Vivian Fry are no longer beneficiaries of the Fry Family Trust. Neither is Garrett Fry, whose role in the actions taken against Sienna Fry has been documented and submitted. He paused. He will be notified separately by certified mail. My father had not moved. He was looking at the document with the expression of a man watching something he spent his life building disappear, not dramatically, not with sound or fire, but with the quiet finality of a signature on a page. Additionally, Howard continued, federal referrals have been submitted this morning to the FBI's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The documentation package compiled over the past 6 months covers wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion spanning approximately 20 years. He said it without inflection, the way you state a fact that does not require your opinion. Those processes will proceed on their own timelines. We have no further involvement in them. He produced a final document, a single page, the header bearing the words, Emergency Protective Order, granted that morning by a Multnomah County judge. This prohibits Douglas Fry, Vivian Fry, and Garrett Fry from contacting Sienna Fry, Arthur Reeves, or any employee of the Common Table. It prohibits entry to this building and any property held within the trust. He set it gently on the pile. It is effective immediately. My mother stood up. She did it slowly, the way people move when they are not sure their legs will cooperate. She looked at Silas. Just looked at him for a long moment with the face of someone who has arrived at the end of something and is only now beginning to understand how long ago it actually ended. She did not speak. She picked up her handbag from the counter, turned, and walked to the front door of the store. The bell rang. She was gone. My father sat for another moment. Then he stood. He did not look at me. He did not look at Howard or at Arthur. He looked at his father, one long, unguarded look that contained more than I will ever be able to name, and then he walked out of the common table for the last time. The bell rang again. The store held its breath. Howard gathered his documents, nodded once at Silas, once at me, and quietly excused himself through the back. I heard the rear door close. Then there was nothing, just the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of traffic from the street, and the morning light moving across the floor. Silas sat down on the stool my father had vacated. Arthur touched my arm and stepped away far enough to give us space close enough that I knew he was there. That was Arthur. That would always be Arthur. I sat down across from my grandfather. My hands were in my lap, and I was looking at the torn half of the photograph still lying on the counter, the edge where the paper had separated, rough and uneven the way things tear when they are torn by hand rather than by scissors. "Why didn't you tell me," I said, "any of it, earlier?" He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone avoiding an answer, but of someone selecting the truest version of one from among several true things. "Because I needed to know you could do it without me," he said finally. "Not because I doubted you, because you needed to know. And because—" he looked at me steadily. "The moment you knew I was there, you would have been fighting for both of us. I only wanted you to fight for yourself." My eyes were burning again. I pressed my fingers flat against the counter. "Did it work?" I asked. He looked around the store at the photographs, at the hand-lettered signs, at the light coming through the front window onto the cream-colored tiles that we had uncovered by hand in the first week. "Look around you," he said. By 6 o'clock the store was quiet. The last customer had left at 5. Derek had locked the front door, turned the sign, and headed home with a look on his face that said he had witnessed something today he was not entirely sure how to categorize. Louise had stayed an extra 20 minutes to restock the end display, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that ordinary tasks are sometimes the best response to extraordinary events. And then there were 4 of us. Natalie had arrived at 4:30, having seen Arthur's message from that morning, and driven down from her apartment in 20 minutes without being asked. She had not said much when she walked in, just looked at me and opened her arms, and I had walked into them and held on for longer than I probably should have. She smelled like turpentine and the lavender hand cream she always kept in her bag, and it was possibly the most comforting thing I had encountered all day. We sat on the floor of the store, Silas in the one chair Arthur had pulled from the back office, the rest of us cross-legged on the cream tile, a box of tamales from Mrs. Rosa open in the middle of us. She had appeared at the side door at 5:15 with enough food for 12 people, and the simple explanation that she had seen Douglas and Vivian leave and thought we might need something. We ate. And slowly, in the way of conversations that have been waiting a long time to happen, the questions came. "Walter," as I said, "tell me." Silas looked at the tamale in his hand. "Walter Cole has worked with me for 40 years, he said. "He managed 3 of my properties at different times. He is the most reliable person I have ever known." A small pause. When I needed someone to be present here without being me, he was the only person I asked. Natalie looked up. "He seemed so ordinary." "Yes," Silas said. "That was the point." Arthur leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "Martin Hale," he said. "The fund that took Garrett's money. Did you know—" Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew Hale had been operating in Europe for several years. I knew the structure of what he was doing." He looked at Arthur directly. "I did not arrange for Garrett to find him. But when I learned that he had, I did not make a phone call I could have made." The room held that. None of us rushed to fill it. "He would have found another way to lose it," Silas said quietly. "Not an excuse. Just a thing that is probably true." I looked at my grandfather. At the lines in his face, the careful stillness of his hands, the weight of all the years he had spent watching and waiting and choosing with great deliberateness what to act on and what to leave alone. "The safe," I said. "The documents. 20 years." 20 years, he confirmed. I did not know in the beginning what I was collecting them for. I told myself it was prudence, habit, the instinct of a man who has learned that the world is more orderly when things are written down. He looked at me. But I think if I am honest, I knew from quite early on that the day would come when those documents would matter more than anything else I could give you. I looked around the store, at the warm light falling across the shelves, at the hand-lettered product cards, each one bearing a name and a sentence, a maker, and the thing they had made, and the reason it mattered. At the photograph of our first market day, 42 people and 4 tables, and enough hope to embarrass the reasonable part of me when I thought about it now. At the half of a torn photograph still resting on the counter where my grandfather had placed it that morning. Arthur reached over and took my hand, and I let him hold it, and for a long time none of us said anything that needed saying. This store had never been just a store. It had been a test I did not know I was taking. A vault I did not know held my future, a platform that a neighborhood had needed long before I arrived to build it. A place where an elderly woman had cried over 40 jars of hot sauce and reminded me that the smallest dignities are sometimes the most profound ones. It had been the one true thing in a life built by other people's design on a foundation of lies. And now, standing in the warm, golden quiet of a Tuesday evening in the place my grandfather had always meant for me to find, it was finally, completely mine. The door opened and my grandfather stepped in. The final truth was laid bare, closing a bitter loop of family betrayal. Watching my parents collapse under the weight of undeniable evidence, I realized that the ultimate revenge wasn't making them bankrupt, it was forcing them to look into the mirror of their own conscience. I spent 3 years of my youth consumed by resentment and debt. The costliest lesson I learned is this: do not let someone else's darkness swallow your light. God teaches us about forgiveness, but He also grants us the strength to seek justice. I didn't choose blind hate. I chose the truth. My sincere advice: don't be like me. Don't let yourself stay trapped in the cage of family betrayal for too long before taking action. When facing family betrayal, stay sharp and protect yourself instead of merely hoping that those who hurt you will change. Every plan for family revenge leaves scars, no matter how perfect it is. I believe that money can be earned back, but trust once shattered is gone forever. Never place profit above kin, for the price you'll pay is a lifetime of solitude. The most successful family revenge is living better and shining brighter than those who tried to pull you down. End this cycle of family revenge by building an empire that is entirely your own. What do you think about Sienna's choice? Leave a comment below, share this story, and subscribe to the channel for more sophisticated and profound life lessons.